Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Welcome to Deep Pockets with Petra Söderling, the show about government and innovation. I hope you enjoy today's episode and the music created by a New Orleans jazz icon Leroy Jones. Find this and other Leroy Jones tunes wherever you get your music. Today on Deep Pockets, we're talking about the human foundations of frontier technology. Quantum computing is often discussed in terms of breakthroughs, new drugs, cleaner energy systems, or entirely new industries. But who actually builds these technologies and who gets to shape the future they create? My guest today is Camille Georges, quantum technology specialist at the World Economic Forum, WEF for short, who recently wrote a World Economic Forum blog about the risk of a growing gender gap in the emerging quantum economy. In her article, Camille argues that without deliberate action, the underrepresentation of women in fields like physics and computer science could translate into structural bias in the technologies themselves. Today, we'll explore what does the World Economic Forum do in quantum, the gender pipeline in quantum science, why diversity matters for frontier technologies, and what governments, universities, and companies can do to design a more inclusive quantum future. Camille, welcome to Deep Pockets.
Thank you so much for having me, Petra. It's nice to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you become the person you are today? And how did this person end up working for the World Economic Forum as a quantum specialist of all things? Because it doesn't sound like something one lands by design. I mean, I can't imagine that you are a young girl at at school and then you just decide to become a quantum specialist at the World Economic Forum. So how does it? Or maybe you did. I don't know. So tell us how that happened.
Sure. So actually, as far as I can remember, I've been, passionate about science and specifically physics. I loved really being in the lab and experimenting. And so science and physics was quite kind of an obvious choice for me. But then how did I come with quantum, right? So throughout my career path and my education, I decided onto pursuing physics and experimental physics specifically, because of my passion of being in the lab, and then exploring the different fields within experimental physics. Quantum was really such an interesting and inspiring field where it's a very wide field, but also so many things have still to be discovered. So it's very much super, super interesting, and I thought it was such an interesting area I could go with. So I decided into specializing in quantum from my engineering diploma. And then I worked in world-class research facilities in the private and the public sector through that education. With this experience, I actually got also to think about how these technologies can actually be useful. This is also coming from conversations I had with people that were outside of the field that would tell me, that's great, you're doing research and you will do that your entire life and you will find nothing. I found that was a great point. That people wouldn't see why quantum is such an important field and why we have to do research and do work within this field. So after my education in experimental physics, I decided to pursue an MBA because I was interested by this translation. How can we translate cutting-edge research happening in quantum labs onto applications that will transform societies and industries? And so following my MBA, I've been in the quantum industry ever since. I first joined a quantum startup working as the director of operations in Canada. And now with the World Economic Forum as a specialist. Within the forum, I focus on shaping the global conversation around quantum technologies. So that actually means connecting the public and the private sector, so governments, startups, researchers, and industry, to ensure that as quantum scales, it does so responsibly, sustainably, and inclusively.
Wow, that's we like everything you just said here in Deep Pockets. That's exactly what we do. But what a journey for you, from physics to engineering to MBA in the private field and now in the public field. So we're recording this in March 2026, and it's just days after the International Women's Day, which was on March the 8th. You wrote a blog post on the WEF website, which is titled "Why the Quantum Revolution Risks Leaving Women Behind and What to Do About It." And your article argues that the quantum revolution could unintentionally reproduce existing gender inequalities. So why is this moment, while the quantum industry is still emerging as an industry, why is it such a critical window to address this particular issue?
That is indeed a great question. And as you stated earlier, this is a technology that promises enormous benefits, new drugs, energy systems, advanced materials. But this is actually a design moment for these technologies. And we see from history that shows that when technology is built by a narrow segment of society, the solutions that result are rarely representative. And this is actually sadly not theoretical. We have data that backs these statements. So first, if we look at the quantum industry, many different academic fields feed this industry. If we look at overall, in 2022, women only represented 56% of a first-time tertiary entrance. So that's above half of the tertiary entrants across OECD countries that were female, but only 15% of women choose STEM fields, when men were 41% to choose STEM fields. So already as a whole, there is an underrepresentation from women. Computer science is one of the fields that is key for the quantum industry. And currently, women account for only 23% of computer science graduates. But in 1985, it was actually nearly 37%. So the representation dropped from almost 15%. This is actually a very interesting example, because in the early years of modern computing, the majority of software professionals were female, while men dominated the hardware sector. And in the 1980s, with the advent of personal computers, that actually marked a turning point, with a significant increase in the number of men studying computer science, while the number of women remained stable. And overall, this has decreased the representation of females in the field. Three main stereotypes shaped this field in a problematic way. One, the geek, passionate about computing. Two, the hacker, skillfully building systems from scratch. And finally, the entrepreneur, creating a company from a computer in his garage.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, these three stereotypes found to be extremely gendered. In physics, which is also a very important field for the quantum industry, we see also a low representation of women. They only account for 25% of physics bachelor graduates in the US. And globally, women only represent less than 1/3 of researchers, according to UNESCO. Because of that imbalance into the education field, the industry reflects that. if we only look at quantum open source software, there was a survey done by the Unitary Foundation that showed that only 19% of respondents identified as female, while 73% as male. In cybersecurity, which is also a key area and related advanced technical fields, women represent roughly 20% of the workforce. These structural gaps compound. So underrepresentation in academia and in education becomes underrepresentation in startups in the industry. Underrepresentation in the private sector becomes underrepresentation in leadership. And underrepresentation in leadership shapes funding priorities, research agendas, standards, values. Quantum is an emerging industry, a fast-paced but emerging industry. And so that is precisely why the window is so important, because once a system scales, its foundations harden. So designing foundations is always more difficult and more expensive than building them right the first time. So if we wait until the industry matures, the imbalance will be embedded.
Absolutely. I have a story about the personal computer thing. I was actually, I'm old enough to have been alive and watching TV in 1984 in the US. And that's the year when the personal computer was introduced. And at that particular year, the advertisers were advertising one specific toy for girls. It was called the Cabbage Patch doll. And because they had this doll that was like selling really well and all the little girls wanted this doll, they had to come up with something for the boys, and they decided the personal computer is only for boys. And that is when the whole segregation of toys, the gendered segregation of toys really took place. So before 1984, when you go to a toy store, you just see toys that are colorful toys for children. But after 1984, after 1985, gradually towards the 90s, the toy stores become like pink and blue, pink toys for girls. So it was crazy how powerful the marketing for PCs for boys, and how the number of the women computer scientists, it never recovered from that. It's just crazy.
Indeed.
So, okay, so thanks for that background. You were talking about the number of women entering the STEM educational field. And from education to industry, there's something that is called the leaky pipeline. You've described this leaky pipeline in your blog post. So it's a leaky pipeline of women from education to industry. It means the female integration in the STEM workforce drops significantly after the first year they enter. So can you talk about the leaky pipeline? Where do you see the biggest drop-off points for women in quantum-related fields like physics and computer science? And additionally, you point out in your article that when technologies are designed by a narrow group, bias can become embedded in the system, as you just mentioned before, and you said this is the moment. And by the way, I loved the design moment term. I'm going to steal that from you. I'm going to start using this term, design moment. So what lessons should the quantum sector now learn from past examples like, let's say, healthcare or AI?
Mm-hmm. So indeed, if we look at this pipeline and this leaky pipeline problem first, so as I mentioned, women are not absent from higher education and secondary education programs. 56% of tertiary entrants are women, but only 50% choose STEM, while 41% of men would choose STEM. And even when women enter STEM fields, their integration into the workforce drops sharply after the first year. So that's what we call the leaky pipeline. This is actually the first transition from graduation to industry, which is the biggest leak. And after that initial first year within the industry, women are actually less likely to leave the field. So the real issue lies into this entry and this early stage inclusion. The problem is that in the longer term, biases will become a feature of the design, because we see that when large segments of the population are excluded, bias is not a bug, but it's embedded in the design. And this is something that indeed we've seen in healthcare. So if we look at that particular example, women spend on average 25% more of their lives in poor health than men. And this is partially due to a lack of sex-based treatment, development, and delivery. So if we look at female-specific conditions, for example, endometriosis or uterine fibroids, they have been historically under-prioritized in healthcare research. Other conditions, such as Alzheimer or depression, affect further women than male, and some other conditions manifest differently in women than in men. We also see that women were historically underrepresented in clinical trials. Sex-specific analysis was often not performed. Many treatments were tested primarily on male populations, and this contributed to male default dosing, diagnostic standards, and symptom models. So this situation actually resulted into a measurable economic and societal cost for women, notably with delayed diagnosis and suboptimal care. We do see that research priorities can shift when large segments of the population are underrepresented in decision-making roles. And the lesson from healthcare is simple. If inclusion is not actually intentional from the design stage, inequity can become systemic. And quantum should avoid replicating these male default patterns that have historically shaped medicine, but also parts of the digital economy.
Yeah, that's kind of scary as a woman to hear. So you've laid out the problems, the challenges. Let's look at some structural solutions, like looking ahead into the future. And you mentioned the structural changes in academia, such as Carnegie Mellon's approach to computer science admissions. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? What kinds of institutional changes could realistically move the needle in quantum science and industry? And if the quantum industry gets this right, if it actively builds a more inclusive talent pipeline, what could a truly diverse quantum ecosystem look like, say, 10, 20 years from now?
Mm-hmm. So indeed, as you state, some institutions have been implementing measures that made a difference. And this is the case of Carnegie Mellon University. They started with a very low representation of women in their computer science programs. And they actually managed to reduce this gender gap by fundamentally rethinking the entry requirements for the program. So instead of requiring prior coding experience from candidates, they focused on competence, and they adapted the environment to be more inclusive for women. And they actually achieved higher gender diversity without compromising their status. Carnegie Mellon University's computing program is still ranked as top 10 today. Cool. So that shows that we can actually make a difference without decreasing the quality of a program and solving or reducing very significantly this gender gap. And if we actually get this right, in 10 or 20 years, a truly inclusive quantum ecosystem could look like this. First, gender balance labs, no longer stuck at 25% of women in physics. Two, having women leading quantum startups, leading research centers, shaping these funding priorities and applications. We already see pioneering women in these positions, but we need to have more. Third, having diverse research agendas with this higher representation of women that can shape the technical and the strategy priorities. We would also see femtech breakthroughs powered by quantum simulations. So quantum simulations and quantum technologies can also enable new solutions for women's health and for women's specific conditions. And that would be accelerating innovation in an area that was historically underfunded. And finally, a culture where decision makers actively ask themselves who is invisible, who is actually missing. So technology that is actually serving equality. And of course, this would go through avoiding replicating this male default bias and unlock this full 56% of tertiary talent that is currently under-leveraged in the STEM pathways. This would actually ensure that the next foundational technology is built by society and by a good representation of society, because inclusion at the design stage is key. We also see very interesting initiatives from around the world. This year, there is a project at the Eiffel Tower which aims to correct the Matilda effect, which is an effect that undermines or erases women's contribution in research. On the Eiffel Tower, there is actually the names of 72 great scientists engraved in one of the tower's floors. And these are 72 male scientists. And this project actually wants to inscribe the names of 72 female counterparts along with the male names, which would result in dismantling this Matilda effect and showcasing women's technical achievements from all types of scientific fields, from chemistry to computer science. This, I think, are initiatives that, can make a difference also for representation of women and recognition of their contributions.
That's so fascinating. I had never heard of this Matilda effect. That's so cool. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your thoughts with us today. There's just one more thing I will ask you. I asked this same question from all of my guests because I want to end in a positive note. So would you leave us with something personal, Camille? Something that makes you happy today? Tell us something nice.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what really makes me happy is seeing women take action, not waiting for permission, starting their lab, launching their startups, building the networks, mentoring the next generation, being leaders and recognized leaders in their field in quantum technologies, just like you, Petra. And seeing the young generation actually not only entering the conversation, but shaping it.
This has been Camille Georges, Quantum Technology Specialist at the World Economic Forum. Thank you so much for coming to Deep Pockets, Camille.
Thank you so much, Petra, for having me.
You've listened to Deep Pockets with Petra Söderling, the show about government and innovation. If you liked today's episode, please subscribe, like, and share our show in your social media. It means a lot to me and to my guests. The wonderful music you heard is by a New Orleans Hall of Fame jazz icon Leroy Jones. Find this and other Leroy Jones tunes wherever you get your music. This podcast, as well as the recording of my audiobook, is done by Chris Elliott at Studio Agus in south of France. Get in touch with Chris to book studio time in our beautiful village, and why not come and taste the natural local wines from La Robina Winery while you're here. À votre santé.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.